It was a crisp gray morning in March 2000 when the ordinary cracked open, and something sinister slipped quietly into the everyday. Fulham, southwest London, where early spring drizzles veil Georgian terraces and the hum of the city never ceases. Nothing about that day felt out of place, except for what came after. A young estate agent, Suzy Lamplugh, stepped out with her appointment book clutched in hand and never returned. Her diary noted a name that would soon seep into the nation's consciousness like ink on damp paper: Mr. Kipper. No one knew then that these two words would haunt the fabric of a grieving city for decades and come to symbolize the space between the known and the unknowable. In that silence, in that name, began one of London's most enduring and agonizing mysteries. Her last known moment flickered briefly on CCTV: bright coat, purposeful stride, vanishing toward a viewing in Shorrold's Road. She was due to meet a man interested in a property. His name, she'd scrawled hastily, was Mr. Kipper. The time was set for 12:45 p.m. But as the clock ticked past 1, then 5, with no word from Suzy, her office began to buzz with unease. They tried her phone, no answer. Her car, a white Ford Fiesta, was later discovered abandoned in a quiet street in Fulham, unlocked, the handbrake off, keys missing. In the door pocket lay her purse. But Suzy was gone. As if she had stepped off the curb and into a parallel London, the city's bricks and cobblestones swallowing her whole. And hovering over it all like a cruel whisper carried on damp air, was that name again? Mr. Kipper? In the hours that followed, hope wavered between routine and panic. It wasn't uncommon for agents to run late, to lose track of time in the maze of London's listings and traffic. But Suzy's colleagues knew her punctual, meticulous, uneasy about meeting strangers alone. As day melted into dusk and her name went unanswered across the office intercom, concern shifted into dread. Police were called, doors were knocked, but already it felt too late. There was no sign of struggle at the property she was meant to show. No witnesses recalled seeing a man resembling the infamous Mr. Kipper. All that remained was a breadcrumb trail of absence, her coat left behind in the car. The seat pushed back as if someone taller had driven it, the engine still warm when found. These were not footprints but smudges, impressions in fog, the sort of clues that don't give answers but raise questions. And in the shadows of those missing hours, the city itself seemed to pause, waiting for an explanation that would never come. The name Mr. Kipper soon transformed from a scribble in an appointment book into a specter that gripped a nation. Newspapers inked it in bold, talk shows whispered it like a taboo, and police sketches tried desperately to give a face to a ghost. One woman remembered Suzy mentioning the name casually, almost jokingly, as if it were a play on words or a nickname. But the silence that followed her disappearance twisted that harmless quirk into something menacing. Kipper detached, elusive, oddly intimate. A moniker that sounded almost made up, as if designed to disorient. And maybe that was the point. As detectives combed through Suzy's notes and life with clinical precision, they found no known clients by that name, no matching phone number, no trace of the man she had gone to meet. It was as if this Mr. Kipper had stepped out of fiction and into reality for just long enough to pluck Suzy from the world and then simply vanished, returning to whatever dark corner he'd come from. In the days that followed, Suzy's face, the bright eyes, the half-smile forever paused on a faded photograph flooded headlines and lampposts across the city. Police set up a task force. Lines of inquiry reached out like spiderwebs, tenuous, cloaked in speculation. A reward was offered. Hundreds came forward with tips, each one fainter than the last. Was she spotted walking with a man near Putney Bridge? Did someone see a woman matching her description, arguing on a bus? Each account seemed plausible, yet none could be verified. Behind closed doors, her family, frozen in grief, clung to any sliver of hope while knowing deep down that something irrevocable had occurred. Outside, the world kept spinning. Trains ran, flowers bloomed, but to those who knew her, time had cracked. And still, no face, no name, no arrest. Just the echo of one word spoken over and over beneath breath, in interviews, in dreams: Kipper. The name circled further and wider into the national bloodstream, a lifeline for an investigation adrift in shadows. Then, months later, a chilling ripple: a convicted murderer named John Cannan, recently released from prison before Suzy disappeared, emerged from the cold files as a possible suspect. He bore some resemblance to Mr. Kipper, as described in vague witness composites. He had a history of targeting women, and most alarmingly, he had once used the alias Kipper himself. The revelation crashed through headlines like a winter tide, reigniting the case with a furious surge of speculation. But as quickly as hope flared, it retreated. No forensic link, no confession, no irrefutable evidence to anchor accusations. The police, though increasingly convinced, could not pierce through time and law to draw a definitive line from Cannan to that gray March day. Suzy's mother, heartbreak carved in every word, publicly pleaded for answers, but still silence. A hollow silence, the kind that eats through years. Because when the abyss stares back, it doesn't offer closure, it only takes. Behind the scenes, the Metropolitan Police were unraveling timelines minute by minute, chasing ghosts down alleyways of possibility. They scrutinized CCTV footage for flickers in the corners, reviewed phone records for blips in the silence, interviewed former offenders in case the name Kipper rang familiar in darker circles. Still, it was the incompleteness that tortured them, the persistent lack, a case built on shadows. They reconstructed Suzy's final movements with painstaking care, yet each reconstruction failed to conjure her back. It was as though something invisible had swept in, gently lifted her out, and erased the imprint entirely. Over time, even the term missing began to feel like an insult, too hopeful, too sanitized. She wasn't just missing, she had been taken, consumed by a London that could no longer account for all of its stories. Among city lights and shouts of pub laughter, her absence screamed quietly, endlessly, and the spectral figure of Mr. Kipper loomed large over every unturned stone, every unanswered phone call, every unbearable birthday she was not there to blow out the candles for. In slow and painful ripples, the case threaded itself into British consciousness not just as an unsolved crime, but as a symbol of how someone could vanish without noise, how justice could sleep with both eyes closed. Years passed, marked not by progress but by press conferences that offered little more than weary reassurances. Suzy's image aged only in memory, her face unchanged in the public domain while the world moved reluctantly forward. The Lamplugh family, dignified and relentless, turned their torment into purpose. Diana Lamplugh co-founded the Suzy Lamplugh Trust, a beacon for personal safety and a quiet rebellion against the abyss that had swallowed her daughter. But even hope, even activism, could not plug the hole left behind. Every anniversary became a wound reopened. Every media revisit was a resurrection of pain. And hovering, still ageless, faceless, silent, was the name that never answered back, Mr. Kipper. The man made of doubt, of shadow, of smoke, a stranger etched into the soul of a tragedy that time could not fade. Years turned into decades, but the silence never softened. In 2002, police made the unprecedented move of officially naming John Cannan as the prime suspect in Suzy's disappearance. It was an act both symbolic and strategic, a declaration without indictment, a spotlight without shadow. They searched his mother's home in Sutton Coldfield, lifting up floorboards and digging through concrete, reaching for a trace of Suzy now believed to be long gone. But once again, the search returned nothing. Emptiness had made its nest in the heart of the case. Cannan remained imprisoned for other crimes, the rape and murder of Shirley Banks, and yet, Suzy's case continued to hover frustratingly beyond prosecutable certainty. The law, precise and demanding, was not interested in almost. And so, a family haunted by a name and a public clinging to fading hope were offered perhaps the cruelest resolution of all. No closure, just the eternal overcast of a question never answered, a ghost home never shown. And a man who introduced himself once perhaps with a smile, in a name that never should have mattered, Mr. Kipper. But what if the story didn't begin with Suzy, didn't begin on that March day at all? What if its roots ran deeper, twisted through corridors of systemic failure, hushed reports, and missed chances that predated her disappearance? In the aftermath of naming Cannan a suspect, journalists and investigators dove into archives, looking not just for direct links but for omissions cases that echoed in tone and cruelty. There were similarities between Suzy's vanishing and other assaults and abductions, brushing uncomfortably close to negligence. Why had Cannan, a man deemed a high risk to women, even been released when he was? Why were warnings from prison psychologists dimmed until they faded? The more they dug, the more the narrative turned inward, not just to the monster presumed to be Kipper, but to the society that might have let him roam. The estate agent went to meet a client. That was all, a routine part of her work. But nothing came of alarms raised previously. And perhaps that was the darkest irony. Suzy Lamplugh, whose legacy now champions safety and awareness, once walked unshielded into a void shaped as much by apathy as by evil. That day, she carried a notebook, wore a neat suit, smiled, and vanished into the cracks of a city filled with witnesses, none of whom saw a thing. In 2018, 32 years after Suzy disappeared, a fresh dig began, this time at a property in Sutton Coldfield, once connected to Cannan. Hopes surged as news cameras captured the mechanical thrum of excavation equipment slicing through ground thought long settled. For a brief moment, it felt like resolution might be within reach, that the earth itself might surrender what countless manhunts, interrogations, and newspaper columns had failed to uncover. But after 2 grueling weeks of digging in the cold mud, the search was called off. Nothing. Once again, silence, dirt, and void. The scene became emblematic of the entire investigation, driven by urgency, steeped in tragedy, and ending in the cruelest stillness. Death perhaps was not the true antagonist here, but erasure. And so Suzy Lamplugh remained in the spaces between the unseen corners of a room once shown to a stranger, the pages of an appointment book that meant only to measure time, not end it. And Mr. Staidlamp, Kipper, whether man or mask, faded back into the dark folds of London's labyrinth, unclaimed, unearthed, and unanswered. Yet within the hollowness, a paradox persisted. The more time passed, the more Mr. Kipper became real. He was spoken of like folklore, a cautionary tale whispered to young professionals walking alone to late appointments. He became a shape in the corner of the mind, a ticking clock in the hallway of unsolved crimes. Plays were written, documentaries aired, petitions signed. But none of it conjured his face, nor led to where Suzy's light had gone. Families lit candles, detectives retired, and somewhere within the city's concrete ribs, London kept its secrets. Perhaps he was never truly one man, but the embodiment of everything left unspoken every time a woman walked into a room and felt the temperature drop, every time the law blinked too slowly, and evil uncoiled itself unnoticed. Mr. Kipper was not just a man. He was absence made flesh, memory warped into nightmare. A name no one forgot because he never gave us anything to remember. And in that silence, Suzy's voice lingers not as an echo of despair, but as a pulse of unfinished love, still asking the question the world has never been able to answer: where did she go? In the bowels of every unsolved tragedy, there lives an ache for patterns, a desperate search for logic that might rewrite horror into prevention. And so, investigators widened their gaze. Could Mr. J 60 Kipper have struck before? Could he have struck again? Files were reopened, tapes replayed, and the cold breath of older cases rose once more into the present. One name emerged dimly from the archives: Sandra Court, vanished in 1986, only months before Suzy. Another, Lisa Hessian, murdered in Lee with eerie similarities. Each case bore the shadow of a predator who knew how to elude both time and justice, but none of it fit perfectly. Just almost. Always almost. Mr. Kipper remained unplaceable, like smoke held in a clenched fist. Even DNA, that modern miracle of certainty, gave no answers because it could not touch what had never been found. And so the threads frayed again, and the grief that had once blistered turned into something quieter, weightier. Not the sharp stab of loss, but the dull gravity of all things unsaid. London did not forget, but it no longer looked. And as the lights flickered on across thousands of windows, somewhere in the dark, Mr. Kipper remained just out of reach. Not watching, perhaps, but never truly gone. Still, amid the catastrophic emptiness, a single question refused to be buried. What if Suzy Lamplugh knew more than anyone realized? In a recent disclosure unearthed from personal notes provided by the Lamplugh Trust, Suzy had allegedly expressed concerns about feeling watched, about uneasy encounters with men posing as clients. Friends recalled odd phone calls, an unsettledness in her voice when discussing some recent viewings. These fragments, once dismissed as coincidence or overwork, now illuminated the possibility that Mr. Kipper was no spontaneous horror, but a storm gathering over time, marked by test visits and emotional reconnaissance. It was a chilling thought that her fate may have been written across several meetings, red flags fluttering in the background while everyone, including Suzy, tried to stay professional, polite, efficient. Perhaps the greatest cruelty was not just in her disappearance, but in how foreseeable it might have been written, not in prophecy, but in paperwork, in instinct overruled, in the quiet calculations of a predator who had prepared carefully. The city moved on, but beneath its surface, beneath every listing, every showing, every name and every phone number, there remained a trace of her, an unheard warning, in a voice now gone. And perhaps that is what haunts London most, that Mr. Kipper might walk again, unseen, even now, through those same streets she once vanished into, for not all ghosts leave footprints, and not all hunters look like monsters. And still, after every search and every statement, the story remains aching, unfinished. The passerby who sees a weathered missing poster taped to a lamppost doesn't know its history, but they feel it. An unease like something sacred has been misplaced. The years have stolen answers, but gifted echoes, whispers of who Suzy was and what was taken. Her name has become more than the case. It is invoked in conversations about safety, embedded in training programs, immortalized in laws. But victory, if it can be called that, is forever shadowed by absence. Because justice, when it fails to arrive, doesn't just mean freedom for the guilty, it means prison for the grieving. And in London, beneath the city's indifferent pulse, that grief still lingers. Mr. Kipper, whether name, mask, or myth, remains a symbol of the cracks that let darkness seep in. Some say evil hides in shadow, but in this case, evil wore a polite smile, made an appointment, and walked through the front door. And as long as the question endures unspoken, what really happened to Suzy Lamplugh, the story does not rest. It breathes, cold and patient, waiting, always waiting for the truth. So we are left with this, the closing of a file that never truly shuts, the sound of a name that still echoes, though no one dares speak it above a whisper. Suzy Lamplugh's story is not just a mystery, not merely pages in a binder stored on a cold shelf. It is a living wound, dressed in bureaucracy, pulsing in the fabric of a city, too busy to notice the spaces where people disappear. And perhaps that is what makes it so enduring. Not the horror of what was done, but the quietness of how easily it could happen again. A missed phone call, an unlocked front door, a name, never meant to carry weight, now carved into place as a warning. Mr. Kipper did not just vanish Suzy Lamplugh. He vanished trust, time, peace. And until the day someone dares to speak his real name and hold it to the light, her story will go on retold, not as folklore, not as fear, but as a tender fury, glowing softly beneath the surface of every unanswered question. And maybe that is why Suzy's story continues to matter, not because time has revealed her, but because it hasn't. In a city coated with millions of faces, hers remains fixed in place, not as a victim, but as a catalyst. Conversations change because of her. Policies evolve. Lives have been saved because her name reminded us not to forget. And though the truth has never come home, something of her still walks those London streets, not in fear, but in echo, in resistance, in the courage of every woman who says no to unease, every professional who moves more cautiously, every new case that insists the past be honored. Mr. Kipper may never be found. He may have died, changed his name, slipped from history like water through cracks. But Suzy has not disappeared, not truly. She lives where the unanswered questions burn brightest, where justice still knocks on closed doors and hope clings to old maps. Her story is not closure, it is insistence, a voice louder than silence, refusing to fade. There's a certain poetry in how the world remembers the disappeared, not through endings but through the sudden absence of the expected, an appointment missed, a mother left holding phone lines that would never ring again, a city with one less heartbeat it never felt leave. Suzy Lamplugh's name remains tethered not to what happened to her, but to what didn't. No conviction, no testimony, no grave. And in that suspended ending, she became a mirror for every unsolved sorrow, every woman told to be careful, every door opened to a stranger who was smiling. Mr. Kipper was never supposed to become part of our language, but he did. Not as a man, not even as a suspect, but as a symbol of the unfinished. As London breathes onward, under gray skies and glinting towers, her story waits not beneath headlines but in the quiet watchfulness of the city she once walked. Because some questions don't fade, they settle into the bones of a place, whispering across time that one day someone, somewhere, must answer them. And so, we arrive not at an ending, but at a place where endings refuse to form. Behind padlocked file rooms and aging evidence bins, behind the weary eyes of retired detectives and a mother's eternal candle on the windowsill, the pulse of Suzy Lamplug's disappearance still endures. Not as a cold case, but as a warm ache. the kind that lingers when the world turns the page too soon? Mr. Kipper, whether he was real or an alias etched in malice, didn't just take a single life, he fractured something larger. Our sense of safety? Our belief that daylight cannot harbor monsters. But what survives is not that theft. What survives is Suzy. In stories, in reform, in the cautious footsteps of a woman walking to meet a client and checking the street twice, in the voice of someone who chooses not to stay silent. The city may have swallowed her story whole, but in its ache to forget, it ensured it never could. Because some names do not belong to the past, they belong to the questions we must keep asking, until silence itself finally cracks open and tells the truth. Years fade, layers of dust settle, but the question remains, what does justice look like when time buries the door to truth? In the absence of a trial, in the utter lack of resolution, justice has taken on a new shape. It has worn the face of public memory, spoken itself through every frantic headline, breathed from every parent too afraid to let go of their child's name. Justice, for Suzy Lamplugh, may never wear the robes of courtrooms or the certainty of verdicts, but it lives in the vow that her story will not go quietly. It is found in the relentless hum of inquiry, the quiet rage in each investigative report, the symbolic keynote her name carries in seminars and safety campaigns. And it lives in defiance against forgetting, against dismissing, against waiting passively for closure that may never come. So the final chapter is not written in answer, but in refusal. Refusal to close the book, to believe this mystery unsolvable, to let her name be swallowed by shadow. Because Suzy Lamplugh is not just a footnote in crime history. She is a presence, unburied by time, illuminating the places where darkness still hides. And as long as her name is spoken, insisted upon, and etched into the conscience of a city that once lost her, she is not gone. She is the silence that demands to be broken, the answer that refuses to be erased. After so many years, Suzy's photograph still framed with hopeful eyes, and a trusting smile functions less as a missing poster and more as a relic, a symbol, a plea. Perhaps the most devastating truth of all is this. Mr. Plaben of Screet from here and Peasants, Kipper may never be unmasked, and Suzy's final moments may remain sealed beneath layers of silence too thick to penetrate. But her story, in its harrowing incompleteness, has ignited centuries of caution and countless conversations, reshaping both law and lore. Her absence has become presence. And as each cold gust of wind moves through the alleys of Fulham and every echo bounces off the aged buildings of Shorrold's Road, something of her lingers unseen, unresolved, unforgettable. The city that swallowed her continues to carry her, not in answers, but in the way sidewalks remember the weight of her steps. Not every mystery gets solved, but some refuse to die. And within that refusal spoken softly in every instance, a woman listens to her instincts, chooses caution, trusts unease. Suzy speaks, not from a courtroom, but from the collective memory of the ones who will never let her name be just a case file. She is the question that will not close, the silence that cannot win. And perhaps that is the quiet epilogue the story truly deserves, not sealed in gavel strikes or prison gates, but held, gently and powerfully, within the choices we make every day. To pause when something feels wrong, to question when answers come too prepared, to remember a name not because it was buried under suspicion, but because it beaconed change. Mr. Kipper remains an enigma, a cipher written in vanishing ink. But Suzy Lamplugh's legacy is carved deep into protocols, into training sessions, into the protective instincts we've only just begun to name. In the end, she was not lost. She was multiplied, reborn, in each person who refuses to look away, in every silence broken before it becomes a headline. And though the city remains indifferent, though justice may forever walk one step behind, her story leans forward through time, not with closure, but with an open door, one that warns, one that teaches, one that will never quietly shut. And so it ends not with justice served, nor with truths unveiled, but with echoes echoing still. Streets change, buildings rise, lives move on. But some shadows remain unchanged, repeating their shape beneath new lamplight. Suzy Lamplugh was one of thousands navigating the ordinary, dreaming toward tomorrow, carrying no mark of tragedy, only a notebook and a name. Yet her absence taught the city to question its silence, to listen harder to unease, to remember that evil does not always announce itself. Mr. Mitterless, to dbleeslozen.com. Kipper, whoever he was real or imagined, walks now not among us, but within us, in every flicker of doubt that asks, "Am I safe?" It is not enough. It will never be enough, but it is what she left behind. A legacy born not in her vanishing, but in our refusal to let the story fade. Fulham grieves still. London remembers still. And Suzy, a name once spoken as an alert, is now spoken as a vow. That we will not forget. That we will not stop asking. That we will not let silence win. And even now, under the hush of low clouds and the restless shuffle of a city that no longer looks his name in the eye, something remains unfinished. Not in headlines, not in evidence, not even in memory, but in the breath that catches each time someone checks over their shoulder on a quiet road or hesitates before unlocking a door for a stranger. Mr. Kipper has become mythology, not because we don't know who he was, but because we fear we always will. And Suzy Lamplugh, her name woven into steel and statute, remains not as a girl forever 25, but as a story London keeps telling itself when it cannot sleep. Because in the end, her disappearance was not the fading of one person, but a revelation of how fragile safety can be when we trust the ordinary to protect us. And so we remember not the terror, not the torment, but the echoing ache of a question unanswered, the gentle push of a life interrupted, and the vow that somewhere, someday, the silence that swallowed her will speak. Until that day comes, the city moves as it always has. Buses rumble past corners where posters once fluttered, estate agents tuck appointment books into briefcases, and strangers still shake hands with masks on their faces. But somewhere in this daily theater is a shadow seat that will never be filled, a name that tightens like thread through the folds of time. Mr. Kipper, silent still, has outlived his mystery, becoming part warning, part wound. But Suzy Lamplugh, the woman who smiled her way into history's unsolved pages, remains the one element that cannot be erased. Her life was not defined by that final moment, but by the force it sparked in everyone left behind. In every shift toward safety, she rises. In every policy born of pain, she prevails. And in every story like hers that we still demand answers for, she lives again. Because she was never just a victim. She is the voice in the room when we finally dare to speak the silence away. Time doesn't heal something like this. It only muffles it, wraps it in softer cloth until another story, another name, speaks it back to life. Yet for all its veils and overgrowth, Suzy Lamplugh's story never grew quiet. It threaded itself into the DNA of modern Britain. Behind every safeguarding protocol, every whispered warning about lone meetings, her name pulses like a lighthouse buried beneath the waves. There is no solving this, not in the way we crave. But maybe the answer lies not in unmasking Mr. Kipper, but in who we become because of what was lost. Across London, doors still click shut behind smiling strangers. And in each moment the question endures. Is this finally where the truth will break through? Or will it, like that March day, remain a breath between seconds, forever falling beyond reach? Until someone knows. Until someone speaks. Until someone, finally, finishes the story. And maybe that is the legacy we carry. Not a solved case, but a measured vigilance seated in one woman's vanishing. Suzy Lamplugh is no longer only a photograph on aged newsprint or a chapter in crime documentaries. She is a presence sewn into city streets and safety talks, into every cautious pause before an open door. In never learning what became of her, we learn to see the outline of what is missing, to feel the disquiet in the absence of answers. Mr. Kipper remains as he always was, untethered, unclaimed, an echo that outlasted its voice. Yet Suzy remains too, not in bone or evidence, but in the shift she created in the spaces where we choose caution, where we trust unease, where we protect what once was overlooked. London's silence could not defeat her. Though it swallowed her steps, it failed to erase her presence. And that is the final truth this story offers, that even in her disappearance, Suzy refused to be lost. So, as London's tides rise and fall over Shorrold's Road, and as another spring dawns in quiet grays over Georgian brickwork, we are left with a story not settled by conclusion, but shaped by reverberation, an unsolved mystery that pulsates with the weight of everything left unsaid. Suzy Lamplugh never returned from her appointment, but she returned in other ways, in the defiance of families who refuse silence, in the laws that now acknowledge our vulnerability, in the faces of every person who hears her name and feels something unspoken stir. Mr. Kipper remains the shadow that started it all, a name that tore through certainty and left behind only questions. But Suzy she endures as something far more lasting than myth. She is remembrance sharpened into resolve. A name still spoken when we hesitate, when we reconsider, when we choose safety because it was once denied. And though her story closes here unanswered, unclaimed, unfinished, it is not the darkness that defines it. It is the flicker of light we carry forward, each time we say her name and mean not just who was lost, but what must never be forgotten. So let it be known, not in mournful tones, but in the quiet strength of remembrance, that Suzy Lamplugh is not a closed chapter. She is the dust on forgotten files that still demands to be lifted, the crease in every story where justice paused but did not end. Her legacy is not etched in discovery, but in every life lived a little more cautiously, in every protocol that now asks more questions, trusts instincts, listens harder. Mr. Kipper, whether phantom or predator, is powerless against that. For darkness does not erase what it cannot silence. And so as the years trail ever onward, as the city reshapes its bones and street lamps blink into drizzle, Suzy remains unfound, yes, but not unfelt. Her absence became presence. Her silence gave rise to voices. And her story, still prowling the quiet places of our collective conscience, does not whisper goodbye, it insists, look again. Look again because, somewhere, in a box file tucked beneath decades of dust, in the grainy pause between final sightings and unanswered questions, the truth still waits. Not dead, not even dormant, but quietly biding its time beneath layers of doubt, bureaucracy, and collective forgetting. Suzy Lamplugh's appointment never ended. It is frozen in a moment that begs to be thawed. And Mr. Kipper, whether he wore a name tag or a smile too wide, whether he was one or many, real or spectral, is not the final chapter. He is the lock, awaiting the right key, the silence waiting for the voice brave enough to shatter it. Let this be the inheritance, not grief without end, not caution as a substitute for justice, but the courage to confront what frightens us most, that someone is still out there who knows exactly what happened. And when that truth rises, not if, but when may Suzy's story finally find its answer, not in vengeance, but in the simple, sacred justice of being heard. Until then, we carry her story like a lantern passed hand to hand, illuminating the dimmest corridors of memory and warning. We honor her not by solving what cannot yet be solved, but by refusing to let it be forgotten. Suzy Lamplugh was not a riddle nor a symbol. She was a daughter, a colleague, a woman with dreams as ordinary and as blindingly bright as anyone's. And though her light was stolen, it was not extinguished. The mystery that took her remains unfinished, but the message she left etched not in revelation, but in remembrance is profound. That silence is not protection, that vigilance must walk beside compassion, and that in the heart of every unsolved story lies the power to shape the future. So we close this story not with a conclusion, but with a promise, to keep asking, to keep listening, and to never let her name grow still. Suzy Lamplugh is not lost. She is waiting to be found. And so, in the quiet closing breath of this tale, there is no curtain call, only an unfinished sentence that history keeps returning to with every new voice that refuses to let it trail off. Suzy Lamplug's disappearance may never be solved in the way her family hoped, but her name has become more than a touchstone for tragedy. It is a flame kept alive by the persistence of memory. In the empty silence where justice faltered, community rose. A city once drowsy under the weight of anonymity now moves with sharper eyes, because of one woman who simply went to do her job and never came home. She was not forgotten. She was transformed. And as long as her name is spoken not as defeat, but as a call to vigilance and care, then she remains among us, not lost, not abandoned, but guiding. A voice in the shadow that says, be present, be careful, be heard, and above all, never forget the name Suzy Lamplugh. So let this be her afterword, not marked in justice delivered, but in justice demanded. Perhaps Suzy Lamplugh's final chapter was never meant to be penned by courts or convictions, but by a society reshaped through her absence. Her story lingers not because it is incomplete, but because it compels us to protect what she was never given a second chance, a safe return, a warning heeded. As the rain gathers gently on Shorrold's road and the city moves on in perpetual rhythm, Suzy stands within it, still a fixed point in a map of memory, a voice louder for never having spoken her last word. The door she walked through remains open in our minds, unfinished and waiting. We are her witnesses, not only to what was taken, but to all she left behind, a reason to stay vigilant, to believe survivors, to question the ordinary. And though the man called Mr. Kipper remains a blur smeared across time, Suzy remains sharp, bright, unwavering, not in disappearance, but in defiance, a name no shadow could ever silence. And in the final beat of this quiet storm, where truth still burrows beneath layers of dust and time, it is not fear that endures, it is resolve. Suzy Lamplugh did not step into legend because she vanished, but because she left behind a scar deep enough to change the pulse of a nation. Her story taught us that trust, when misplaced, can become a weapon, and that absence, when profound enough, can teach presence louder than any voice. We may never meet Mr. Kipper, may never hold his face to the light, but we know this: Suzy's name will echo longer than his silence. For in every locked door, every second glance, every whispered instinct he once sought to exploit, he has been outlived. She remains, her name etched not only on a trust, not only in legislation, but in the woven caution and courage of 1,000 lives she unknowingly saved. What was taken from her will never be repaid, but what she gave in return will never be taken. And so, it ends not with a door finally closed, but with one still left slightly ajar, a breath between answers, a flicker in the dark corners of collective memory. Suzy Lamplug's vanishing remains one of London's most haunting absences, not because it is rare, but because it is tragically familiar. Her final walk into anonymity etched a permanent outline across our sense of safety and forced us, irrevocably, to change. And while Mr. Kipper may remain faceless forever, painted only in shadows and suspicion, Suzy's legacy burns bright like an unquenchable flame. We may never find the voice that silenced hers, but we carry forward the echo. In precaution, in protection, in vigilance born from heartbreak, her story remains unfinished only in form, not in impact. And that, perhaps, is where justice lives now, not in names unearthed, but in the lives held safer because of one woman's light, never truly extinguished, still reaching us through the dark. The question remains, as persistent as the morning mist that clings to Fulham's cobbled streets: where did she go, and who watched her vanish? It is a question that has echoed far beyond police inquiry rooms and newspaper headlines, whispering itself into the heart of every person who has followed her story. In Suzy Lamplug's disappearance lies more than a mystery. It lies the fragile threshold between routine and rupture, between trust offered and trust betrayed. The man who called himself Mr. Kipper may never be found, but the name hangs over this case like unfinished breath, the final punctuation withheld. Yet in this never-ending sentence, Suzy's legacy continues, not confined to pages, but forged in vigilance, compassion, and change. She is not lost in the silence. She is the silence, cracked open wide enough to let the light back in. And even if justice never arrives in the form we crave, her name ensures we will never again look at the ordinary without listening closely for the footsteps of what might lie behind it.